Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Trump deploys 4,000 National Guards and troops and 700 Marines to Los Angeles amid fourth day of immigration raid. Israeli strikes have killed 3 medical workers and a journalist in Gaza City's Tufa neighborhood. According to Palestinian media, Israel continues its military operations following the October 2023 attack, with Gaza health authorities reporting over 54,900 Palestinians deaths so far. The UN warns that most of the flour it delivered to Gaza since mid-May has been looted or seized by starving Gaza residents. As famine looms, the UN has rejected working with the US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, citing concerns over aid militarization and forced displacement. The US President Donald Trump says Iran is now involved in ceasefire for hostages talks between Israel and Hamas. The US-backed plan proposes a 60-day truce, but Hamas has rejected the deal so far, asking for a permanent ceasefire instead. Israeli forces struck Yemen's Hodeidah port, according to Houthi-run media, following Israel's warning to evacuate key Red Sea ports amid escalating tensions. Meanwhile, Israel has not confirmed the strikes, but retaliatory actions have been reported earlier. US-China trade talks in London will extend to a second day as both sides seek to revive the Geneva Truce and address export controls on rare earth minerals. President Trump called the talks upbeat, while a White House advisor said Washington is looking for a handshake deal on critical mineral controls. Chinese President Xi and South Korea's President Lee hold key call on trade, security, and denuclearization. Meanwhile, Lee invited Xi to APEC, and both sides stressed stability, trust, and deeper regional cooperation. Russia strikes Ukraine again. Drones hit Kyiv and Odessa overnight, killing 2 and damaging a maternity ward. Kyiv faced hours of air raid sirens as drones targeted civilian areas. Ukraine calls for stronger sanctions and air defense support. The US President Donald Trump has escalated the federal response to protests in Los Angeles, deploying another 2,000 National Guard troops and 700 US Marines. The move comes despite opposition from California's Democratic leaders. Governor Gavin Newsom called the deployment deranged and un-American, warning that Trump is using the military to intimidate Americans on their US soil. Trump blamed what he called insurrectionists for violence in Los Angeles and praised his decision to send in troops. He later suggested he'd support the arrest of Governor Newsom for obstructing immigration enforcement. Here's what Trump has said.
He's daring Tom Homing to come and arrest him. Should he do it? I would do it because I think it's right. Of course, the Abbott likes the publicity, but I think it's a great thing. He's done a terrible job. Look, I like Gavin Newsom. He's a nice guy, but he's grossly incompetent. Everybody knows. All you have to do is look at the little railroad he's building. It's about 100 times over budget. We're putting a flagpole over there. Under budget. I always do under budget.
Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass condemned the federal raids that triggered the unrest. She urged the Trump administration to stop the raids and respect state authority. Here's what the California mayor has said.
Stop the raids, period. I would say give the power back to our governor, and if we need the National Guard, we can do it in the normal circumstances, which is the request is made local and the governor decides or not to grant that to our city.
And have you been in contact with
The UN has expressed concern over the situation, urging all sides to avoid further militarization and calling for calm, stability, and restraint across all levels of government. Here's what the UN spokesperson has said.
We certainly hope that all parties on the ground will de-escalate the situation. We do not want to see any further militarization of this situation, and we encourage the parties at the local, state, and federal levels to work to do that.
Is President Trump sending National Guards considered militarization?
I think you are aware of what the situation on the ground is, and what we want is to see a de-escalation.
Protests broke out after ICE agents detained dozens across Los Angeles last week, while demonstrations have since calmed. Officials say the federal troop presence is straining local agencies. California has filed a lawsuit against the federal government, calling the deployment unconstitutional. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has condemned the shooting of reporter Lauren Tomasi in Los Angeles. He called the footage horrific and said she was clearly identified as media. Albanese confirmed his government has raised the incident with U.S. officials, calling it unacceptable. Here's what the Australian Prime Minister Albanese has commented. Meanwhile, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has urged the U.S. to follow due process in migration cases. She also condemned violent protests, warning that burning police vehicles was provocation, not resistance. She urged Mexicans to remain peaceful. Here's what the Mexican president has said.
No estamos de acuerdo con las acciones violentas como forma de protesta. La quema de patrullas parece más un acto de provocación que de resistencia. Debe quedar claro, condenamos la violencia, venga de donde venga. Llamamos a la comunidad mexicana a actuar de manera pacífica y no caer en provocaciones.
Russia has launched another massive drone strike on Ukraine just a day after its biggest attack yet. In the latest onslaught, 2 people were killed in Odessa and a maternity ward was damaged. In Kyiv, drones struck 7 out of 10 districts, setting off fires and injuring at least 4 people. The overnight raid lasted 5 hours with air raid sirens ringing until dawn. City officials say residential areas, civilian infrastructure, and open spaces were targeted. Ukrainian presidential aide Andriy Yermak said terror can't break Ukrainians. Foreign Minister Sibiha called for tougher sanctions and urgent air defense support. In Odessa, drones hit a medical facility, including a maternity hospital. 9 people were hurt and staff were evacuated. Moscow says these strikes are retaliation for Ukraine's recent attacks on Russian air bases and bridges. While peace talks have resumed after years, progress remains elusive, with ground fighting also escalating in eastern Ukraine. In a significant development in the Ukraine war, Russia and Ukraine have begun what could be the biggest prisoner exchange of the conflict so far. Monday's swap involved young prisoners of war under 25 and severely wounded soldiers following direct talks in Istanbul on June 2nd. sides agreed to exchange at least 1,200 POWs and repatriate thousands of war dead. Neither revealed Monday's exact numbers, but Moscow says the exchange was equal on both sides. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that the first group had come home, adding more stages will follow in the coming days. Russia says its returned troops are now in Belarus receiving care. Kyiv says some freed soldiers have been captive since the war's beginning. Let us listen to what Ukrainian President Zelensky had to say.
Сьогодні стартував обмін, перший етап домовленості в Стамбулі. Всього буде кілька етапів. Принаймні, саме про це говорили з російською стороною. У цьому обміні мають бути поранені, також важко поранені, і також ті, кому 25 років і молодше. Очікується, що процес обміну триватиме ще не один день. Деталі процесу доволі чутливі, тому зараз інформації менше, ніж зазвичай. Я дякую всім, хто допомагає здійснити обмін і працює, щоб всі наші люди могли повернутися додому. Додому з російського полону.
Now we have guest Gilbert Doctorow. He's a Russian affairs expert joining us live from Brussels. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. How do Russia's latest drone attacks on civilian areas, including a maternity ward, affect the perception of Moscow's military strategy, both domestically and globally, according to you?
On Russian by Russian missiles and drones on facilities in Odessa are an inadequate response to the attacks on the 1st of June by Ukrainians on the air bases in carrying strategic bombers last week. And it just amazes me that this has been muddled in Russian communications, which speak about a revenge or retaliatory strike for those air bases in what was an attack on the Dubno tactical aircraft base in Ukraine. The point is that the Russians suffered a great humiliation when their major strategic bombers were damaged in the Ukrainian strike, with an attack with great implications for Russia's nuclear triad. These attacks, counterattacks by Russia on, say, this Dubna air base and the attacks on Odessa that you have described extensively, are in no way a proper response to what Russia has undergone. And I am questioning whether or not Mr. Putin's staff appreciate what has to be done. You cannot provide for Russian state security by enhancing surveillance across the country or putting military with machine guns at every state building. That does not work. Russia is vast. The attacks that the Ukrainians have staged, both by their bombing bridges in Bryansk and in Kursk, are complemented by actions that they have taken elsewhere, which are much simpler and easier to effect, namely damage to rail lines with the objective of derailing Russian trains and causing havoc or terror among the Russian train travelers. The only solution to that is Moscow's dealings with Kiev, not Moscow's dealings with Odessa. So I want to stress that the Russian response has been inappropriate to the strategic defeat that they suffered when the Ukrainians made their long-range attacks on air bases in Irkutsk and Murmansk and whatever 1 week ago.
And according to you, how should we interpret the renewed but limited negotiations between Moscow and Kyiv? Do they represent genuine progress, or are they simply optics?
They are simply optics. Well, having said that, they achieved something very important on humanitarian grounds. The families of those returning young soldiers and wounded, injured soldiers an exchange that began yesterday, they are all comforted by seeing their sons, their brothers, their fathers, their husbands in their midst once again after months or longer in captivity as prisoners of war. That is all to the good. At the same time, those who have lost, and particularly on the Ukrainian side, those who have lost contact with their relatives who were fighting on the front and whose bodies are now being held in refrigerated trucks near Belarus. They are disappointed. They must be disappointed by their president's, by Mr. Zelensky's refusal to let that aspect of the agreements reached 1 week ago in Istanbul to be affected. They are speaking now of 6,000 dead Ukrainians whose bodies are, shall we say, in limbo. They are neither here nor there. The Ukrainians are refusing to accept them because they'll have to make a very large payout to the widows. Well, so be it. Nonetheless, to answer your major question, the technical agreements which are being implemented now in the prisoner exchanges in no way have a bearing on the resolution of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. They are not leading us any nearer to a ceasefire or to a final settlement of the war. That is sad, but it has to be admitted frankly.
And now, zooming out to the bigger picture, what role, if any, can the US or European allies play in pushing both sides towards a sustainable ceasefire, especially amid Trump's recent comments calling for a resolution?
Sad to say, nothing. There is nothing that the Europeans or the Americans can do to resolve this crisis in relations between Kiev and Moscow. Both sides have laid out in their memoranda their objectives in peace talks and in ceasefire talks. And these are mutually exclusive objectives. Each side is demanding that the other side, in effect, capitulate. That is unreasonable, completely unreasonable for the Ukrainians because they are the losing side in this war. Massive suffering, massively greater casualties and deaths than the Russians are, and losing territory day by day. On the Russian side, the capitulation that they're demanding of the Ukrainians is not justified by their achievements on the battlefield so far or in their dealings with the Ukrainian regime. It is only by a decapitation of that regime that the Russians can obtain their objectives. And it appears to me that Mr. Putin and his colleagues are not yet ready for that drastic step.
And that brings us to another critical question here. Given Russia's advances along the Eastern Front, are we looking at a new phase in the war, one where Ukraine's territorial losses could escalate without increased Western ally support?
The chances of increased Allied support are close to nil. Western Europe has cleaned out its armories. It does not have war materiel of great substance to give to the Ukrainians, and it certainly is not prepared to give any manpower assistance. So the United States is slowly, quietly exiting the scene, and so the notion that the United States could step in and prop up Ukraine is not realistic. The Ukrainians, on this other hand, have more resources and greater commitment to continuing the fight that many of my peers in alternative media tend to believe. Ukraine has not been defeated. Those who are predicting the collapse of Ukraine in a week or two are talking without justification. Ukraine continues to have very strong drone warfare going on. When you listen to Russian television, as I do day by day, and you hear reports from the field as their war reporters interview soldiers manning artillery stations or tanks, and they're telling you that after they fire on Ukrainian positions, they have to move immediately to avoid the counterattack, the responding fire from the Ukrainian side, you understand that the Ukrainians are not fleeing the field. The Ukrainians are largely standing firm and fighting to the death. So this is a war that is fierce, and it is not at its point of conclusion yet.
And going back to the recent strikes, what do these strikes reveal about Russia's tactical shift, especially after Ukraine's recent attacks on strategic sites within Russia, the spiderweb attack operation?
Some of my peers have been saying that the Russian position in the war has changed, that this war is not an artillery war in the traditional sense. It is becoming a war on terror as far as the Russians are concerned. They have identified the Kievan regime as supporting state terror. The logical conclusions from that should be an attack on the decision-making centers in Kiev, but we see nothing of the sort. Instead, we see more intense attacks on individual cities, more drones, more missiles. That will solve nothing. It will not change the nature of the war in a way that the Russian rhetoric suggests. The terror attacks cannot be defeated by greater surveillance, by more police on the streets guarding government buildings and high personalities in Moscow or elsewhere. They can only be resolved when there is what Russia said it wanted on February 22nd, 2022, regime change in Kiev.
Thank you very much, Gilbert Doktorov, for bringing your expertise as a Russian affairs expert to our conversation today. Thank you very much. Now we move on to our next story. Israeli authorities say activists aboard a Gaza-bound aid boat are currently being detained and awaiting deportation after their vessel was intercepted in international waters. The ship, named the Madeleine, was carrying food and supplies to the war-ravaged Gaza Strip, where the UN has warned of severe food shortages. French President Emmanuel Macron has called for the immediate release of the activists, including 6 French nationals and Swedish campaigner Greta Thunberg. He called for the reopening of humanitarian supply routes. Let's listen to what he said.
Ensuite et surtout, la France appelle à un cessez-le-feu au plus vite et à la levée du blocus humanitaire. Le scandale, l'inacceptable qui se joue à Gaza, c'est cela. Et c'est ce qui, depuis début mars, est une honte. Une honte. Et donc, j'ai encore eu et le président...
The Madeleine was towed to the Israeli port of Ashdod after being stopped overnight. Israel released the first images of Thunberg following the interception, confirming that all passengers are safe and unharmed. The situation highlights ongoing tensions surrounding aid efforts to Gaza amid the long-standing blockade and escalating humanitarian concerns. Now we move on to Europe. Trade talks between the United States and China have entered a second day in London as officials from both sides try to ease growing tensions over tariffs and export curbs. The first round wrapped up Monday at the historic Lancaster House. Discussions will resume Tuesday morning. China's team is led by Vice Premier He Lifeng and includes senior trade officials. The U.S. side is represented by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. One key issue: China's slow release of rare earth exports, crucial to many industries. The U.S. says Beijing is not fully honoring a deal made in Geneva last month. President Trump, speaking to reporters Monday, said he's only getting good reports from London last week. He held his first phone call since returning to office with President Xi Jinping, calling it very positive. Any breakthrough in London could ease global markets and boost demand for key commodities. Let us listen to what the US President Trump had to say.
We are doing well with China. China's not easy, just like your home country is not easy there. I think we're doing very well. They're over there now. I'm only getting good reports. It's a little early, but they'll be calling in soon. In fact, probably when I get back, I'll have my first call from them. We want to open up China. And if we don't open up China, maybe we won't do anything, but we want to open up China. It'll be a great thing for China, a great thing for the rest of the world.
Chinese President Xi Jinping and South Korean President Lee held a highly anticipated phone call today, focusing on deepening ties across multiple fronts. Lee expressed hope to expand cooperation in security, culture, and the economy, and invited Xi to attend the APEC summit in South Korea later this year. Both leaders agreed to work together on economic growth and strategic stability in the region. She stressed that China-South Korea relations must stay on the right track, calling for mutual respect, stronger trust, and more exchanges at all levels. He also pledged support for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and called for both countries to safeguard free trade and strengthen supply chains. She added that a healthy and stable relationship between China and South Korea is essential for regional and global peace. World leaders have issued a warning against the rush to exploit minerals on the ocean floor, cautioning that unregulated deep-sea mining risks turning the seabed into a modern-day Wild West. Speaking at the United Nations Ocean Conference in Nice, France, French President Emmanuel Macron called for an international moratorium on seabed mining. He talked about a high-sea treaty to protect seas and oceans. Let's listen to what Macron has to say.
Nous avons travaillé d'arrache-pied ces derniers mois, et c'est pourquoi nous avons, il y a quelques instants, annoncé qu'en effet, au 1er janvier prochain, ce traité pourrait entrer en vigueur et qu'enfin, nous allions avoir un cadre international pour réguler, administrer la haute mer. Et qu'enfin, nous pourrions protéger, lutter contre la pêche illicite dans 65% de nos océans qui jusque-là étaient une zone de non-droit. Nous avons d'ores et déjà 55 ratifications effectuées et déposées, une quinzaine qui sont en cours avec déjà une date sûre, une quinzaine qui sont en cours et qui se feront d'ici la fin de l'année, ce qui fait qu'il n'y a plus de doute, et c'est pourquoi nous l'avons officialisé avec le secrétaire général et plusieurs de mes collègues, il n'y a plus de doute pour dire que d'ici à l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies,
The concerns arise as US President Donald Trump pushes to fast-track mining permits outside international regulations, raising alarms over unilateral actions in international waters. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva called for global coordination to avoid unilateralism in ocean governance. UN Secretary General Guterres urged quick ratification of this high seas treaty to protect marine ecosystems from illegal fishing, pollution, and mining. He warned against reckless exploitation that could damage ocean health and said the deep sea must not become lawless. With rising global opposition, the conference marks a key step to protect the planet's oceans. Now we stay in Europe. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has called for a 400% increase in the alliance's air and missile defenses, warning that Russia's aerial attacks in Ukraine show the urgency. Speaking in London, Rutte also urged NATO members to ramp up defense spending to 5% of GDP, with 3.5% for direct military needs and 1.5% for broader security. Here's what the NATO Secretary General has said.
A 400% increase in air and missile defense. We see in Ukraine how Russia delivers terror from above. So we will strengthen the shield that protects our skies. Our militaries also need thousands more armored vehicles and tanks, millions more artillery shells, and we must double our enabling capabilities, such as logistics, supply, transportation, and medical support. Allies will invest in more warships and aircraft.
Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has answered that call. He announced that Canada will hit the 2% NATO defense spending target this year, 5 years earlier than planned. Carney says this move won't require new taxes, adding that billions will be invested in military equipment, Arctic security, and domestic defense industry. Here's what the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has said.
Relatedly, we're doing it as a strong NATO partner. We're a firm believer in NATO, and we're standing shoulder to shoulder with our NATO allies. We'll continue to do so. And of course, the United States is a fundamental ally of the country.
The statements come just weeks ahead of the NATO summit in The Hague, where allies are expected to finalize new spending roadmap. Now we move on to Asia. President Donald Trump says a crucial decision could be near as the US and Iran prepare for a new round of nuclear talks. Speaking Monday, Trump confirmed he made what he called a reasonable offer to Tehran, one he hopes will avert military action. The comments came after a phone call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has threatened to strike Iran's nuclear sites. Trump claims he's held Netanyahu back, stressing, quote, "We are trying to make a deal." But Trump warned Iran's demand to enrich uranium remains a major sticking point. He said their current proposal is not acceptable. While Trump mentioned a meeting could happen Thursday, Iran's foreign ministry says indirect talks are now planned for Sunday in Muscat. Iran's top negotiator will visit Norway midweek before heading to the talks. A breakthrough could diffuse growing tensions, but Trump says the alternative is still a very dire one. Let us listen in to what U.S. President Donald Trump has said.
Prime Minister Netanyahu, you just mentioned Iran. Did you discuss Iran?
Very
Did you
well.
discuss
We discussed
the Gaza war?
Yeah, we discussed a lot of things, and it went very well, very smooth. We'll see what happens. You know, we're trying to do something with a country we just spoke about, Iran. I think you should negotiate this. You might be better. I think I'm going to send you today. What a good idea. This could have been the idea of the day. We'll have Derek get up and negotiate. They are good negotiators, but they're tough. Sometimes they can be too tough. Well, they're just asking for things that you can't do. They don't want to give up what they have to give up. You know what that is. They seek enrichment. We can't have enrichment. We want just the opposite. And so far, they're not there. I hate to say that because the alternative is a very, very dire one. But they're not there. They have given us their thoughts on the deal, and I said, you know, it's just not acceptable.
Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.